you all are serving. Um, Today, I'm going to be talking about how a lot of the work of Pride has to do with housing justice and how relevant that is to the work that you all do today. Thinking of the work of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. But at first, I want to tell a little bit of my personal story. Like I said, my name is Blair Imani. I converted to Islam 10 years ago, but before that, I knew that I was a queer kid. How did I know? I remember being on the playground and seeing this guy that I had a huge crush on. His name was Keith, and I had a big crush on him. And then I saw his sister, and I thought to myself, I think his sister's cute too. And I didn't know what that meant. And I think it's difficult sometimes for people to talk about young people knowing that they're queer because they sexualize it. We saw a little bit of that today. But it's not something sexual. You generally people form crushes. They know who they like, they know who they want to write a Valentine's Day note to. And for me, being bisexual, it was kind of, to more than just one gender. And I felt like at times that was weird or that was different, largely because I
Excuse
hadn't
me,
seen
I'm sorry to
representations
interrupt.
of. Mhm.
We cannot get in. Can someone send a new link for this? Because we cannot get in.
Sure, Miguel, thank you. We'll take care of it. Go ahead, Blair.
There we go. Okay, we're back. So anyway, that was kind of my understanding. And as time went on, there was very, very little queer representation on television. I think today about how much queer representation that there is, queer and trans representation, and how beautiful it is. But for me, I remember, and by a show of hands, y'all can tell me, I remember there was one show, Will and Grace, and that was the beginning and ending of queer representation, especially in the early 2000s. For some folks, that representation was super validating. Maybe they thought they were more of a Jack or more of a Will. But for me, as a queer young person of color, I didn't completely relate. And so I felt like that was the beginning and ending of the representation that existed. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older and there was a show called Degrassi, the same show that Drake actually used to be on back when he was just Aubrey Graham before he started, getting into rap beefs with Kendrick Lamar and messing up his career. But there was a character on that show named Marco. And Marco came out to his father, and it was the most dramatic thing. He's on stage, he's in the middle of a show performance, and he tells his father in the middle of his show that he completely breaks character and goes, Dad, I have to let you know that I'm gay. And I remember thinking at the time, what a dramatic way to come out. That's not realistic. That doesn't happen. Of course, that might be true for someone, but I felt like it was so over the top. Flash forward to me coming out, we'll talk about that in a minute. But when I was 15 years old, I also got it in my head because of, negative language that is so pervasive in not just in our community, but externally outside of our community as well, about this idea of people who are quote unquote living a lie. I'm a big hater of that term because I think that if somebody's living authentically, their ability to share that outside of themselves, outside of their families, and outside of their communities isn't necessarily on them. In many cases, it can be this difficult thing of having to negotiate who you are. A lot of people aren't able to be out at work. I think about how often, especially right now, when things are so politically charged, looking at places like Florida, where there's so much overwhelming anti-LGBTQ plus hate, seeing recent Supreme Court decisions invalidating queer and trans youth, particularly trans youth, and the work by lawyer Chase Strangio to try to fight against that. And there will be some people who will try to discard entire swaths of the country to say, well, everybody in that area is red. But in many of those places, there are people who are still surviving and still thriving. Um, I think of our neighbor when we lived in Louisiana. There was this crotchety old man, and he didn't want to talk to absolutely anyone ever. He was very to himself. And then one day there was a man who was going around doing interviews. I'll have to find the author's name. It's a book called Sweet Tea, Stories of Being Black and Gay in the South. And he was trying to interview, his name's E. Patrick Johnson. And he's trying to interview someone. He was like, have you all heard of Madame Vivian? And we were like, who is Madame Vivian? And then he finds he shows us, and it is this older gentleman who has been the most just kind of standoffish neighbor. It turns out that in the 80s and 90s, and I think into like 70s as well, he was actually a major drag queen in New Orleans. But he had to build up this tough exterior of not being able to let people in, because so many times when he would let people in, he could be denied housing, he could be denied employment. And that's why, I'm going to talk about today, pride is really a housing justice issue. There are so many queer youth and trans youth who are kicked out of their homes, many of whom, particularly with the current administration, are seeking refugee status to places like Canada that have more acceptance. To different communities to make sure that people are able to get the help and housing that they need. And so I always think about that story because while I wouldn't say that our neighbor was living a lie. I would say that our neighbor was surviving. I would say that so many people who aren't able to be out, who aren't able to come out, are simply surviving. In many cases, they're minding their business. There's this huge emphasis placed today on coming out with the massive, a rainstorm of glitter. And for some people, that might be the exact thing that they need. They might be like Marco on the middle of the stage and they can't take it anymore. They can't leave it to themselves anymore. They want to tell their father in the middle of the show who they are. Or you have somebody like me taking it back to when I was 15 and I very dramatically sat my mom on the couch, ABC Family style, which she wasn't happy about because she was working from home and I was interrupting the middle of her workday. And I said, Mommy, I am a lesbian. And she said, have you heard about bisexuality? And I really felt like she stole my thunder in that moment. But what she was trying to do is help me understand that she had kind of noticed this patterns in who I was finding interesting or who I was having a crush on when I was a kid. And so by the time I turned 15, she was able to help funnel me to resources like on the website GLAD, and to learn what bisexuality was and to see that that fit. Of course, I do think gay and lesbian sound a little bit punchier than bisexual, but it turns out I am bisexual. So my mom put me in the right direction. But what an accepting, space to kind of have. And that's not the story that everyone has when it comes to coming out. But I'm really blessed that that's been able to be my story. Um, I would also highly recommend the book Sweet Tea by E. Patrick Johnson, Black Gay Men in the South. But I want to bring it to the people who originated Pride for just a little bit of a moment. I remember I was in New York City and I was talking to this gentleman, and he was talking to me about how back when I was growing up, we didn't have this non binary, we didn't have this trans, we just had gay and lesbian. And I said, that's really interesting, especially given the fact that it was drag queens, that it was gender nonconforming folks are the reason that we have Pride to begin with. Why? Because you don't want to tell somebody that they're wrong, but you also want to help people get on that ladder of being more inclusive and being more, at least a little historically accurate. We have two incredible people that I'm going to highlight today. That's Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, people who absolutely changed the cultural landscape of what it looked like to have Pride, because it was the gay and lesbian movement. And at that time, it was really focusing on gay white men. It's not to say that nobody else existed, and that people were trying to navigate the world and their lives in the best way that they knew how at the time. What that looked like at the time was to try to convince the world that, hey, we are just like you. We just happen to fall in love with people of the same gender. And in many cases, if you look at different parts of the world, even parts of the United States, which can feel like a whole world away, that's still kind of the narrative. And so when it came to the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, it was actually, my dad describes it, my dad's 75, and he's been talking about how similar of a cultural moment we find ourselves in now, where we have these wars raging that people don't agree with, where we have this social unrest, where we have this heightened awareness of things like racial justice and LGBTQ plus rights, but for a huge part of our society, a refusal to completely embrace or understand it. In many cases, we're seeing this against the trans community, where people are being ostracized, where people are being denied the health care and care that they deserve. Again, the housing that they need to be able to thrive, the jobs that they need to be able to have full and complete lives. And then simultaneously, we see people being blamed for suffering their own conditions of oppression, all while people are spending millions of dollars to go to space. And that's kind of what the energy was like back during 1969, during the Stonewall Uprising. We have the moon landing and this kind of external projection of societal progress, technology, space travel, you know, And we can kind of compare that today with the driverless cars. Again, billionaires going to space, AI. We see a lot of technology progressing forward, but then we see a lot of communities that are being left in the dust. And so in this moment, there was this kind of watershed instance of an uprising when, and it's really important to talk about how during the Stonewall Uprising, the people who were there. Some people will say it's drag night. It's also interesting. Think about the best night that you've ever had at a club. Imagine something historic happened there, and now you have to retroactively go down and write everything that happened. So some people say a shot glass was thrown, some people say it was a brick, but the thing that made it so powerful is that it was an uprising against police violence. And for so many people, people like Sylvia Rivera, particularly people like Marsha P. Johnson, young Black queer youth, trans youth who were forced to live on the streets. Many of these folks lived on the streets of Times Square, had to participate in things like survival sex work in order to get by. And that's something that I know you all are experiencing with some of the clients that you're working through, trying to help to get them the mental health care that they need, the shelter that they need, and such a society that is so toxic to people being housed and being whole and being made whole. And so it was with that angst and that pain that Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson approached that moment of the Stonewall Uprising. And that was the case in many cases across the board. The typical clientele of Stonewall were Wall Street executives and bankers who were trying to conceal the fact that they were in fact gay. And so it was this one particular night during Pride Month, and it wasn't even Pride Month yet. But what happened right after the Stonewall Uprising was that there were organizations founded. One was, and this is, I'm going to use an outdated term, but this was a name. It was called STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, was co-founded by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson a year after the uprising in 1970. And it was dedicated to helping, quote, young homeless drag queens, gay youth, and trans women be able to get housing. And I think it's so interesting when we talk about housing justice that sometimes people neglect the different issues when it comes to any type of movement, whether it's disability rights movement, whether it's the movement for Black lives, whether it's refugee rights. People sometimes neglect the aspect of intersectionality within it, that in any circumstance where you're fighting for a specific group of people, you're going to have folks who are left on the margins, the people who are ostracized, the people who are left out the most. And so the people who, at this time, I want to say it was until 1973, but I will have to fact check myself. Go ahead and fact check me if you'd like. When homosexuality was stopped being declared as a mental illness. Today, we're still seeing people use this rhetoric and these talking points against genderqueer and trans folks. And so it's looking at how, they were trying to serve this issue of housing justice during this really difficult time of the 1970s and how much it parallels today. So Star House had a revolutionary model, and it's so exciting because there's an incredible woman whose name is T.S. Madison, who is also doing this important work, I believe, in Georgia, of having kind of a drop-in shelter for people to be able to flee violence, to maybe flee homes that might not be accepting to them, or to escape homelessness. So the legacy continues, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Star House provided shelter for homeless LGBTQ plus youth, with Rivera and Johnson paying rent money that they themselves, in many cases, either got through grants or through sex work. They decided it was a time to help each other and help other kids. They fed and clothed people, and they kept the building going. And so this gets so erased in the legacy of Pride Month. People want to focus on the parades and the celebrations, but it was looking at the day-to-day advocacy and so many of these people who were able to flee rural towns. There were stories of a trans young person who we would today describe as trans, but in many cases they were describing themselves as drag queens. And I think this person later described themselves in different language, who came from rural Virginia, from a very violent upbringing and kind of, system at a time where, the emphasis was on the draft to the Vietnam War. The emphasis continues to be, but very much at that time was on masculinity and how to perform masculinity. And it was the first time they were able to be in an environment and to be in a housing environment where you can be yourself. Oftentimes, our homes are where we can be our our fullest selves. And having that taken away can be so toxic and so detrimental. And so if we look at STAR's work and compare it with today's statistics, we know that 40% of homeless youth or unhoused youth identify as LGBTQ+, despite only being 7% of the total youth population. And then we also know that LGBTQ+ youth are 120% more likely to experience being unhoused or experience homelessness. When we talk about these statistics, many people misunderstand them to think, oh, well, that's just because they can't hold down a job, or that's just because they can't, maintain their rent. And it's kind of the onus is placed on them instead of looking at the structures. Now, I know at Compass, we wouldn't be using that language, but it's worth saying just so we know what the external conversation is and how different it is from the people who actually care about housing justice. And so we also know that 28% of LGBTQ plus youth have already experienced housing insecurity or instability, and transgender and non-binary youth have even higher rates. In many cases, sometimes the research isn't even done to address non-binary youth. And so to know that the people who originated Pride Month saw housing justice as this of utmost importance really highlights why it is so important to be talking about it with a community organization such as Compass. And I think even with that, it's the additional layers of intersectionality. I got into an argument once, which tracks for me, trust. I try to be sweet, I try to do it with a smile, but it was in particular about how if we have Marsha P. Johnson being a Black, trans woman during the Black Power movement, but also during this burgeoning LGBTQ plus rights movement, which to be clear was not the first time of such a movement existed, but we talk about the historical context of the United States, it's important to couch it in those language, how she was simultaneously part of the women's liberation movement, LGBTQ plus rights movement, and Black Power movement. And this person really didn't want to concede that one person could be more than one thing. Then, of course, I bring my identities into it, being a Black woman, being bisexual, being Muslim, a loudmouth. I mean, also a bisexual. And so it's just looking at how many aspects of intersectionality combine. And so when we look at how BIPOC LGBTQ plus youth face even higher risk, or that BIPOC youth have an 83% higher risk of experiencing housing insecurity compared to their non-BIPOC counterparts, it's not to say that one community suffering or one identity suffering is more valid, more important, more significant, or more worth of being addressed. But it's to look at it with an intersectional lens and to be able to say, this isn't the whole picture. This isn't the whole story. How can we address this more? Why is it that my next door neighbor, who is later known or previously known as Madame Vivian, felt like he could never share that? That's because at the time in Louisiana, it was completely legal to, and this was only 10 years ago. I'm actually not even sure if the law has changed, but inshallah, it hopefully has. That this law said you could remove somebody from housing, that you as a landlord could decide to evict someone simply because you did not agree with their quote unquote lifestyle. Now we know that identities are not lifestyles, that they are inherent traits to who we are, and that's hate and violence, but it really makes it plain. And for the outcome of all these conversations to be so and so is living a lie really reduces and erases the factual nature of what people are going through. And so something that I also have to uplift is my sister, who's an incredible advocate, Raquel Willis, who's doing very important work, who's doing that very important work in the Bay Area for quite some time, and the work that she's doing with the Gender Liberation organization, as well as Eliel Cruz. Just shout out to them. The work they're doing is incredible. People are always looking at, we have these historical figures, but who's doing the work in the present? 100% Raquel Willis, 100% Eliel Cruz. But one thing that Raquel Willis often speaks about is the importance of taking pride, not just the parades, not just the celebrations, but also these very deep, necessary things. But it's both and. It's not to say that we can't celebrate pride in these more kind of commercialized ways. It's not to say that it has to be 100% a struggle bus, but we can do both. We can be able to go into spaces of pride, of retreat, of being able to go to that bar or that club and fill ourselves up with the joy of feeling connected to our community. And that's why those community spaces are so important to be able to have, so that people can build up that resilience. Because when you have to go out into a world and scroll the news and scroll the timelines, I see some folks nodding, and constantly feel bombarded with the world not accepting you, not loving you, that's where we see these negative mental health outcomes. That's where we see so much of these difficulties, because people are feeling attacked. And I know right now there's a lot. I'm afraid to log back on to threads after this talk, because every time I log back on, the news is ridiculous. Today's news is ridiculous. And that affects all of us. And so it's trying to do pride in this context that I think creates so many important and compelling parallels to what they were going through during the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 and during that first Pride Month celebration in 1970s. And so Rivera was passionate about advocating for those who were often shut out of the gay rights movement of the 1970s. She was passionate about fighting for people who were shut out of Latino rights movements, people who were shut out of women's rights movements. And we're seeing so much of that very much today. And she also, really interestingly, as a historian, I love seeing kind of the historical parallels compared with today, because as my grandmother would say, same shit, different toilet, which is adorable because she doesn't cuss, but she likes to compare things to the historical context of what they were going through and how similar it is today. Another more perhaps sanitized version of that is the more things change, the more they stay the same. And a lot of that has to do because people have the same motivations, people have similar contexts, and people are trying to fight, for many cases, the same things. But something that Sylvia Rivera talked about was that the gay rights movement at the time was too focused on the middle class and not enough of the working class lives of queer people, which is why she co-founded Star House. And then I want to open it up to questions, because I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Sorry. Um, okay, so now we should talk about T.S. Madison and the important work that she's doing. Let me just pull it up, sorry. Okay, so well, let's just wrap up with the story about Star House before we move on. It was located, and you can still visit it, I believe, at 213 East 2nd Street if you happen to be in New York City. It ultimately closed in 1971 for being unable to make rent, but also there was constant rent increases. There was a lot of hostile landlording. I don't know the particular term for that, but I'm sure y'all are familiar with that. And they were evicted on July 15th, 1971. So it lasted a full year. But there was this kind of feeling, and this was quoted in the Village Voice: "I'm doing more for the gay cause than any of your organizations." And that was really the feeling, that doing this grassroots work was more important than all of these organizations that were dodging and refusing to kind of address and support the people who were the most marginalized. They later relocated in 1973, but ultimately, according to Sylvia Rivera's own account, Starr died in 1973 on the 4th anniversary of Stonewall. They were told that they were an embarrassment and a threat to women because transphobic reasons. So a lot of the struggles that we're still facing today uh, kind of parallel to what we were talking about before. But going into the work that T.S. Madison's doing, she's an American entertainer, an actress, a reality TV star who's become a powerful advocate for Black transgender women through her groundbreaking work to address homelessness and the reentry challenges in the trans community. She's absolutely so incredible. And on March 31st, 2025, coinciding with the Trans Day of Visibility, she started a T.S. Madison Starter House, which I feel is a spiritual successor to Star House. I know there's been similar organizations and similar movements, but it's rare that we see these organizations being able to be founded and started by folks from the community themselves versus external community partners. She repurposed her former home, rigidly known as, of course, the Marvelous Chateau, and it accommodates up to 5 residents at a time. And they have a 90-day transitional housing initiative that provides comprehensive support to services, including stable housing, gender-affirming healthcare, job assistance, support for getting your GED, life training skills, nutrition education, and individualized therapy. I personally would love to see a crossover between Compass and TS Madison House, even though I know it'd be a little bit across the country, but wilder things have happened. But I think it's so important because in centering the people who are most impacted by the harms of this very capitalistic society that we have, I think about people in Florida who are having to deal with being criminalized for sleeping outside, which is a direct, pipeline for the prison pipeline. But being able to have access to things like psychological support and mental health services, all these things are so much more important to me than just repeating these statistics about the life outcomes or life expectancies of our queer and trans communities, because it shows a message of hope. It says, hey, we can support, we can rebuild, we can continue to do this important work. And somebody else that TS Madison has partnered with is a friend of mine, Dominique Morgan, who's the director of the Fund for Transgenerations. And it's just so exciting to see. Somebody else put in the chat a similar organization. Lyric created a Felicia Flames house named after a local Latino organizer who participated in San Francisco's Compton cafeteria riot, which, by the way, precedes the Stonewall Uprising, which, to my understanding, was very closely associated with the Latino rights movement as well as the Black Power movement. And so these stories echo, and it's so exciting to see because it can feel so overwhelming and difficult to navigate the constant barrage of hate and attacks. It can feel so difficult to see everything on your timeline, everything in your news feed, but to be reassured that we have existed throughout all this time. We existed before the hate, we will exist after the hate, we will exist through the hate, and that we will rely on each other to support and strive through these different struggles makes it a little bit lighter of a load, because we know that we're not having to carry that load individually. We're able to share in that burden together. And the burden isn't being ourselves. The burden isn't being queer. The burden isn't being lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender or queer or two-spirit or asexual or agender. The burden is the hate that we experience. The burden is the Supreme Court decisions. The burden is being denied housing, despite the fact that you have all of the credit and all the accolades that you need. The burden is being denied the jobs that you need in order to be able to sustain yourself. And so we're able to carry that together. And so I thank you all so much for having me to your organization. I want to open it up to questions. I know we had a bit of a snafu at the top, but we're doing great now. I'm in the flow state. And I want to thank you again, Rhett, for helping keep us all safe and secure on here. Go ahead and pop your questions into the chat. Anything relating to Sylvia Rivera Marsh P. Johnson's legacy, anything related to the work that I'm currently doing. While people put in their questions, I will also shout out a few more organizations. So the name of the game, particularly right now, and it's not so much a game as it is a survival technique, is helping people get the care and support services that they need outside of institutions. So that's already the work that you're doing at Compass. That's also the work that I do. I'm on the board of the Tegan and Sarah Foundation, and we work to support people on a variety of different efforts. We have a collaboration between GLAMA, which is an amazing healthcare organization for queer professionals, queer and trans healthcare professionals, and it's called the LGBTQ plus Healthcare Directory. We just reached an amazing 5,000 different healthcare practitioners on our platform, and this is all about making sure that when people go to get, care from a doctor or a healthcare practitioner, that they're not going to be called a slur or discriminated against or blamed for their own conditions. Instead, a doctor will work with them and actually take that Hippocratic oath seriously and combine it with a little intersectionality to make sure that it's not anti-LGBTQ plus in its execution. And so that's some of the work that I do, but it's really focusing on these strategies of how we support people outside of these different institutions that continue to be so hostile to us. And so I'm happy to be here today talking with you all at Compass because the work is so important. It will never not be important. It's particularly important in my home state of California. And yeah, thank you all so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Blair, for being here with us, sharing your scholarship, and bearing with us through some of the silliness that happened earlier. Having you here and the work that you're doing is absolutely amazing. For those of you that are here that you want to ask a question, please put your question in the chat. I will read it aloud so Blair can answer. Blair, we had some questions prior to your arrival. So one of the things, and I think most people that know you, especially of a certain generation, have probably seen you on social media with your online viral sensation of Smarter in Second. So in your book, in Read This to Get Smarter, you explore identity through multiple lenses. How do you recommend individuals and organizations to approach intersectionality, especially in service delivery and workplace culture?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I think it's really evolved. I think by the time I was writing Read This to Get Smarter, we all had this big, I guess I'll call it an opportunity for introspection called the COVID pandemic health crisis. Um, and that is the silver liningest way I'm going to look at it. But I do know it was horrible, horrific, and there was lots of preventable loss of life. But as I was writing about identity in the context of that time period, I was really thinking about it because I kind of, I'm 32, I'll be 32 this year. And I kind of grew up in this post Obama, post racial conversation where I remember when he was running for office and there was this whole, wow, Blair, you have mixed heritage. You're really going to be the bridge between this community and this community. Plus, you're bisexual. So you're like half gay and half straight, which I'm sure some bisexuals may identify with. I personally don't and do not find that to be true to my bisexuality as all. Bisexuality is 100% its own thing. But it was really preached this story of being this in-between connector. So I think I took a little bit of that on myself, but then I also found that I was constantly prefacing all of anything I did with, oh, and by the way, I'm Black and a Muslim and woman, da 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 da. And that's fine. But I think a lot of organizations fall short when they begin and end the conversation of intersectionality there. Of course, we can't talk about intersectionality without talking about Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, an amazing woman who originated the term back in her 1989 legal essay, which is a really interesting time because, you're looking at this Black feminist legal theory, and she was really focusing on how feminist discourse wasn't addressing women of color, particularly Black women, and then discourse around racial justice wasn't acknowledging women or any other gender except for men. And so it's looking at that full kaleidoscope of who someone is. How do we apply this at work? Well, I think previously some organizations will do this work, the kind of workshop thing where everybody take a step forward, everybody take a step back. Has anybody been through one of those where they might read a list of different privilege aspects and you take a step forward, you take a step back? I think that can be a really beneficial experience if you're unaware of your privilege. However, if you are a person who speaks English as a second language, who is an immigrant, who, might not have those privileges, it can just kind of be a moment of ostracization. So we have to do this work in a way that doesn't further marginalize people without, and then also we don't want to make the folks who are privileged who are trying to do this work super, feel super uncomfortable and super awkward as well, because everybody should be able to go to a workspace and feel safe, welcome, and whole. And we can do this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, of belonging without doing the problematic thing to begin with, whether it's bullying or oppression. We don't need to do it. And so how do we apply it? I think it's to empower everyone with the understanding that we all have relative privilege, that there is no, well, maybe I can think of a few, they're in charge of the country, but there is not generally the most privileged person to ever privilege and the most oppressed person to ever oppression. We are people who are made up of identities and experiences, and we have these different experiences that can help relate to other people's experiences. So, a person might be able to understand what it's like to be ostracized, because being ostracized means you have been left out. They might experience that when they were a kid at the lunch table. They might have experienced what that looked like to not get hired for a job because of the color of their skin. And so it's a kind of the spectrum. We want to start from a place of empathy. But I think it's important to empower people with an understanding of intersectionality, which is our identities combined with how they simultaneously interact with different systems of oppression and privilege at the same time. So an example of that is I'm a Black woman, but I'm also lighter skinned. You may have noticed. And so that means I am impacted by anti-Black racism, but I also benefit from colorism because I'm lighter skinned. So that means that I have to really be mindful of how I position myself in conversations around Black women to make sure that I'm acknowledging the privilege that I have. And acknowledging doesn't just mean I go, oh, by the way, I'm light skinned. It means that while I'm talking and while I'm featuring people, I'm making sure I'm highlighting folks who might be darker than me, because sometimes you might have access to a space that somebody else doesn't have. And so that's where I think it comes from, the service delivery, being able to tap into the experiences. And there's this very insidious trick of oppression and dehumanization that we all are taught to participate in, which is this person is my in group, these people are my in group, and these people are my out group. That can be with anything. That can be with who you bring to brunch. That can be with these people are Beehive. I love Beyonce and they don't. It can be anything. But what it tends to be is, specifically in care delivery, is, well, these people are my clients and there's like some hierarchy there. And so it's about unpacking and, trying to not internalize that. Today I had a conversation with a refugee family, and part of me wants to go, oh, I could not imagine what it's like to go through that experience. I can't. I don't know what it's like to have left Afghanistan, to have to build my whole life in the United States. But for me to name that that is a barrier to me connecting with them is going to help me better connect with them, because I don't bring that baggage to the conversation. I'm able to sit in the shower while I'm brushing my hair and work that out on my own and go, okay, well, what are some things I can connect with? I moved as a kid. It's not to say I'm bringing my move when I was 8 years old from one house to another to the same level as escaping the Taliban, by no means, but it's to have some place to connect with, because all the work is intersectionality and all the work of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging in some order is to help address gaps in humanity, whether that's how we might have dehumanized ourselves or dehumanized other people. And if we can do that work before we come to a conversation and interaction with other people, oh, it's so much better. It's just kind of like you unclench, you relax, and you're able to sit with people not as strangers, but as members of the same human family. And I think when we frame it in that way, it becomes a lot less intense, and it becomes a lot more connected. That's why I wanted to talk about housing justice, because I don't know that everyone at Compass is queer, has a connection to the LGBTQ plus community, but you have a connection to the work of housing justice. So how can I make it relevant to Pride? We connect those two things, and that's that intersectionality there. So it's always happening. But the hardest thing, I talk to people, they're like, well, how do we get people to care about this? It's hard to get somebody to care, but what we can do is let you know it makes communication more efficient. It makes crisis intervention less, which is great for everybody, and it makes experiences more streamlined. The thing I love is that it opens your eyes, it opens your world up to way more experiences that you might have had otherwise, and you don't have to leave the country to have those experiences. I'll just leave with this story before we go to the next question. I remember I was in Kenya and I was teaching school there, and there were some dirt floors on some of the schools, and I was there with some influencers. This is before I became like an influencer, but like, picture an influencer, it was those folks. And we get there and they're, oh my gosh, the floors are made out of dirt, how sad. And I'm like, well, yeah, in the United States, due to segregation until the 80s, many schools in Mississippi and Tennessee, for example, had dirt floors. And I felt like there was this, they had to leave the country to open their hearts to the experiences of poverty when they could just go to Skid Row, like, and it's not to say those two things are the same. They look very different. They're multidimensional, but it's that you don't have to leave your home, your neighborhood, your locale in order to open your heart to different experiences of humanity. Um, Back then, this was like 2018. I was not as cute and demure about it. I was like, please, because I was in my early 20s. But now I'm kind of able to look at it with a little bit more analysis. But I think that that tends to be what happens, is that people tend to open their hearts up more when they're further away from home. But we need to do it locally because all politics are local.
Absolutely. You're talking about us being one global family, and just recognizing the humanity in each other is so key. One of the things, Blair, that I think you're most well known for, and you do such a beautiful job, is the visual storytelling that you do on your social platforms. And you've made a lot of complex issues a lot more accessible to a global audience. What are some ways that you think visual storytelling or storytelling in general tend to bring the point of education around pride, housing justice, and everything that intersects? How do you think that does it for audiences that may not have access to the type of education or schooling or lectures that you may have been privy to? Why do you think that visual storytelling is so important?
Well, I'll tell you, the first job that I had was when I was, well, one of the first jobs. First job I had was babysitting, but my like first big girl job was when I worked with the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Coalition, and I was so excited to have that job. And my job, I was a graphic designer. That's kind of how I made my way through college, was doing graphic design. And they had these white paper studies about housing discrimination, and they were like, "We need to communicate this stack of white papers to the public." And I was like, that is impossible. But luckily, I had mentors in my life who really encouraged me. If somebody can't understand, it's not on their ability to understand, it's on your ability to teach. So that really made me try to big up and be like, okay, I can do this. And I was like, well, what's going viral constantly is web comics and infographics. So why don't we do the most wild thing, which would be to take this white paper study and turn it into a infographic comic? And it was like we had these little stick figures where you see the black stick figure going to try to get a housing loan or try to get, a property, and they get turned away. But when we have the white stick figure with the same name, same credentials, same everything, suddenly they're approved. And we can show that visually. That's a lot more compelling way to kind of communicate that to somebody. One, somebody who might not be invested in the conversation for whatever reason, somebody who might not be aware of the conversation, somebody who doesn't have the vocabulary. And the biggest thing I think is people who don't have the time. There are so many people who do deeply care about their immigrant neighbors. That's a huge conversation right now. But it's a matter of, how do I deliver in the most streamlined manner what this experience is? I would love to collaborate with Compass on a Smarter in Seconds about housing justice. So Rep, please stay in touch. You're not going to be able to get rid of me that quickly. But I think that it's really important because I think any concept is abstract to someone who hasn't personally experienced it, personally been familiar with it. And I try to make that unabstract. So that might be me doing a sketch in the beginning of a video. When I explain something like, here's what it looks like when you try not to be racist, but you might miss the mark. And I'm not trying to point anyone out. I think, I always appreciated in school when a teacher would say, now, some of you got this wrong. Here's what you got wrong, and here's how you get it right. Instead of being like, Blair, you were wrong. Come up to the front of the class and fix it. Because it puts you on the spot. It makes you stressed out. And it also creates the stress response in your brain where it's hard to accept information. So sometimes being called out isn't the best solution when you're trying to teach people. And so this is a way where I try to I'll have people who maybe are the antagonist in a sketch be able to learn because the pressure's not being put on them. And so I think that, in a conversation around housing justice and housing discrimination, it might be a conversation of, the person who classically might have something horrible to say about a unhoused population, and instead turn that kind of vitriol and dehumanization into empathy and understanding through demonstrating what that looks like and helping people understand, why is the crisis of homelessness so bad in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles? You're only seeing the end result of this, but how do we get to the back part? And then give them a call to action. Here's an organization that's supporting it on a daily basis. So that's what I try to do. And then I also try to connect it to different cultural moments. So recently, well, not super recently, this anybody else feel like this year has been several years, because I'm exhausted. But I remember during the Super Bowl, Kendrick Lamar said 40 acres and a mule, this is bigger than the music. And one of the top search results on Google was, what is 40 acres and a mule? What is he talking about? Why is he talking about horse donkey hybrids into this conversation? And instead I was like, okay, well, this is actually a conversation about reparations. And I literally made the video, and it was like, hey, do you remember when Kendrick Lamar said 40 acres and a mule, this is bigger than the music. Well, he's actually talking about reparations. Let's get smarter in seconds. And then we get into the conversation, and people come out of it with a better understanding of Jim Crow, a better understanding of post-war, post-Civil War America and the Reconstruction period. And they didn't even have to sit through a TED Talk. And then hopefully they stick around and want to learn more, because learning can be fun. But I was 100% raised on PBS. I was 100% raised on shows like Electric Company, Between the Lines, and Sesame Street. And it was a lot more fun to learn your numbers and your letters when it was Elmo teaching it to you versus having to do it when you're staring at a blackboard. If you want to support PBS, by the way, you can go to, and I'll put it in the chat, it's www.protectmypublicmedia.org to take action to support PBS, because it's getting defunded by Congress right now, which sucks. But that's also a housing justice issue, because not everybody has access to media. Not everybody has access to television. And PBS is one of the only broadcasters who is free and available all across the country, no matter what zip code you're in. And that's very much an issue of access and housing as well.
Blair, absolutely. Raised, I think a lot of us here may be raised on Sesame Street or Schoolhouse Rock and so many others, and we would absolutely love to partner with you. Blair, as we get ready to close out, for though as a lecturer, as a scholar, for those that may just be starting out on their journey towards unlearning bias and maybe deepening their allyship or just their knowledge base around housing justice, pride, and anything else of their interest, what are some of the first steps you believe are most important, but also things that are most often missed that you would leave with the audience?
I would say the biggest journey to knowledge and understanding is to remember that not everybody got it immediately, and nobody gets it immediately. Any person who's trying to teach you something and is shaming you for not knowing it, now it's two different things, right? Now, if you're J.K. Rowling and you're out here with access to millions of dollars and you still keep being like, are trans people people? I'm going to shade you all night and day. Now, but if you're somebody who grew up in an environment where you're just now learning that pronouns are a conversation, or the last time you heard about pronouns was relative to Schoolhouse Rock and Rupert Xavier Sarsaparillas, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a pass because you have some time to learn and to grow. So I think that's one thing. Any guilt you have for not knowing something is a waste of space in your brain. You need to replace that with the power to know that you can learn it, that you can do it. And I think sometimes people forget, I did library science when I was in college, so I'm always hyper aware of the access that we have to the library, the access that we have to searches. But I'll have people sometimes in the comment section asking me things like, well, I want to support my local immigrant community. How do I find local immigrant owned businesses? And I'm like, go to Google. And sometimes they'll take that as an attack. No attack, no shade. I'm literally trying to give you the keys, you know? And so I think that it's to have that kind of curious mind. There's so many different documentaries when it comes to looking at housing justice. I think about the Pruitt-Igoe documentary. I think that was the housing structure. Let's just fact check myself in real time since I have access. Pruitt-Igoe. Let's see. It was a project in St. Louis, and then, ooh, that's a whole conversation about racial justice and how it has to do with housing. So there's places to learn. There's also great documentaries on things like Skid Row and how that overlays with, sexism and the need for feminist justice, as well as the rights of queer people. And so I think it's to remember that learning about something doesn't have to look a single way. It can look like watching a TED Talk, going on TikTok, and making sure that people are credible on TikTok. And also the documentaries are credible too. But instead, I think when I tell people to do their research, they think, oh man, now I have to go pull up this huge book. But it can look like reading articles. It can look like so many different things. And so it's just to remember that you have infinite capacity to learn. And even when I make every episode of Smarter in Seconds, I usually start at the baseline 0. A video that I'm working on right now is on limb differences, and that's for people whose arms and legs, maybe they don't have arms and legs, or their arms and legs might look different from typical or normative expectations. Not normal, but normative, like typically expected. And I didn't have that experience, so I have to do that research. And then I'm going from that place to teaching people about it along with folks who have that lived experience. But it's kind of like having this tenacity to learn and to know that it'll make you better at your job. It'll make you better at your primary job, which is being a human in the world, but also at your day-to-day job.
Blair, absolutely incredible. With the little bit of time we have remaining, can you let everyone know where they can follow you, where they can support you, and if you have anything else that people should be on the lookout for?
So I have a podcast called Thoughts About Feelings, which talks about mental health, which I think is very much what we all need right now. With my friend Michael Threets, who's based up Northern California, the librarian. And that's our biggest project right now. And of course, tune into Smarter in Seconds. I'll have a bunch of Smarter in Seconds episodes coming up for Disability Pride Month. And I thank you all for having me.
Fantastic. Blair, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to each and every one of you that joined us for this Inclusion Talk series commemorating Pride Month with the amazing Blair Imani. I hope that everybody has a fantastic day on purpose. You can find this talk on the Compass Family Services YouTube page, and we will partner with Blair. We're going to do a Smarter in Seconds with Blair coming up soon. Have an amazing day, everybody.